Good morning, good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining our final webinar of 2020, Holiday Headaches, Dealing with Relatives Who Just Don't Get It. I'm Kayla Kovac-Galton, the Curriculum and Project Strategist at the Diversity Movement. With the election, a pandemic, and a spotlight on racial inequity this holiday season, there will be more on the table than Aunt Teresa's green bean casserole. How do you handle the stress of free-form bias, microaggressions, and passionate orations that fundamentally conflict with your values? Today, we have our Head of Client Services, Jamie Ousterhout, joined by our three panelists. Jenna Wilson, a consultant specializing in recruitment and brand management. She creates solutions for clients using thorough discovery and market research paired with the data of her recruitment products and branding software services. She works with organizations to facilitate improved communication, collaboration, problem solving, and strategic planning. Eric Galton, a licensed attorney in Texas who has been a full-time mediator for nearly 30 years, having mediated over 7,500 disputes throughout the US. He served as an adjunct professor at University of Texas School of Law for 8 years and continues to serve as an adjunct faculty member at Pepperdine School of Law. Eric has published 5 books about mediation and travels nationwide teaching the course he developed entitled Restoring Civil Discourse in an Overheated Society. And last but certainly not least, we have Ashley Herndon, a compassionate and skilled clinician with extensive knowledge and training in mental health care who works with children, adults, couples, and families. She has experience in a wide range of psychotherapeutic skills, collaboration, mentoring, coaching, and building rapport and trust with varied clients. Our panel list today will help us navigate these situations with grace, empathy, and a little pushback. During this hour, please feel free to drop your questions in the Q&A at the bottom of your Zoom screen at any time, and we'll try to answer as many live as we can. If you're referencing this webinar on social media, please use the hashtag TDMWebinar and tag us on LinkedIn, Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook. To start things off, I have a quick poll for you that I will pull up. The question is, how nervous or concerned are you about the upcoming holidays? Give everyone just a minute to fill that out. Give everyone just a few more seconds. Thank you all for participating. All right, perfect. Now I'm going to end the poll and share the results. So as you can see, we got quite the mixed bag here. So some people not worried at all, a few extremely worried, and everyone in between. Thank you all for sharing that today. I'm going to go ahead and drop out of sight now, and I'll let our host, Jamie, take it from here.
Great. Hi, everyone. Welcome. I am so excited and honored to be the moderator today for this wonderful group of panelists and really can't wait to learn more. I know I am personally more on the extremely worried side of things from our poll. So I'm looking forward. I'm going to be taking notes as well so that I can learn from what our panelists have to say. So just a quick note before we begin, conversations around diversity, equity, and inclusion, especially those that require us to be vulnerable, can also make us feel uncomfortable. We want to allow for compassionate and critical dialogues that lead to personal exploration and growth. If we're not comfortable being uncomfortable in these conversations, we're not doing it right. So let's go ahead and begin. So we know, especially this year, as Kayla said, with so many different things going on, the recent election, racial injustice, and of course, COVID, there's a lot to be talked about around the dinner table. So with so many personalities around the holidays, the first question I have for all of you is, what are your top recommendations for dealing with family at the holidays while still maintaining your sanity and mental health? So Jenna, I'm gonna go ahead and start with you.
All right, I gotta unmute myself really quick. Well, thank you for having us and for hosting this. This is a really important conversation. It's very timely. You don't really know what 2020 is going to hand you. And I think that it is really important to understand your own boundaries. So especially when going into these conversations or whatever holiday, whether you are hosting it, with your immediate family at home or you're having it over Zoom, take a minute to reflect on what topics you think you can touch on and what topics might be a little bit too hot. And already know that going into each event or each conversation. So that way you almost have a designed plan in mind. So that way, if you need to step out for a glass of water, how you want to bring it up, whether you're ready to dive right on in and you have your 3 talking points planned, or exactly how to politely and respectfully decline to engage in that type of conversation. So one of my tips would just be to have a preparation plan.
I love that, Jenna. That's such a great idea. Kind of plan ahead, not just for the meal that you're maybe making, but also for some of those conversations that might come up. That's great.
Exactly.
Ashley, what about you? What would your recommendations be?
Sorry, I had to unmute there. I would echo a lot of what Jenna is saying in terms of sort of preparedness going in. But I think, honestly, to sort of expound on that, thinking about what your triggers might be. So this might be something that potentially has been a pattern or something where when you're around particular family members or, in these kinds of scenarios or situations, there are things that you can key into for yourself to sort of understand when I'm feeling like I want to scream, or when my heart starts to beat really quickly, or I'm feeling very frustrated, or, all of those things, just being able to have an awareness of when that is starting for you so that you can start to enact your plan. So definitely think what Jenna has offered in terms of being thoughtful beforehand, so that when you're in the moment and emotions are starting to rise for you, or you're starting to recognize some of your signs where the next thing out of your mouth might not be the kindest thing, or you're having a harder time to be able to sort of regulate and control what's going on. Just having an awareness of those kinds of triggers, so that this is the point where, yes, I do need to step away. Yes, I do need to set this boundary. Yes, I do need to phone a friend in the bathroom, cry, like whatever needs to happen, so that you can come back to the table, or, figure out what it is that you need to do to get through.
That's great advice.
So I guess in summary, the tip would be awareness of what's happening, or like what will happen for you, so that you can recognize it and be able to do something about it.
That's great advice, Ashley. I know for me, I get very red when I start to feel and get heated. So being able to recognize those and knowing that that's what's happening, I think is really important. So, okay, make a plan, recognize when it's happening. I'm writing these down. What about you, Eric? What would your recommendation be?
Well, we have been through probably an unprecedented period in our history. When you combine the pandemic with the election, we have a society that is probably as fractured and as polarized as in any time in my almost 69 years of living. And people are on edge, and there's just no disputing that. That's where we all are. And you throw in holidays and having to change everything, and it's a very tense time for everybody. So here would be my 2 bits of advice. You'll hear them later on again. But I think one takeaway is redefine your goals when you're having conversations with friends and loved ones. I think most of us, because of what we see on TV, the shouting, talking heads, sort of think or anticipate that every conversation has to be an argument, or it has to escalate, or it's going to be unfriendly. I think if you redefine your goals from persuading somebody or winning a conversation, and convert that to understanding somebody else's perspective, it will create a bridge to a less tense, more full, and more helpful conversation. So I think that's really something you've got to keep in mind, and it's hard to do. You know, part of what we're discussing is it requires some discipline, and it doesn't mean that you have to cave and capitulate on things that are important to you. But, you know, I think what we need now are more bridges than barriers. We've got plenty of barriers. We don't have a lot of bridges.
I love that, Eric. More bridges rather than barriers. That's so important. And two, you know, I find myself, and I am curious what you all would say to this, but I'll work myself up ahead of time. So when I'm creating that plan, Jenna, I'm almost thinking in my head, well, they're going to say this, and how am I going to come back? And I almost think I make it worse than if I actually just take Eric's advice and say, let me try and understand from your perspective. So I don't know if you have any tips, especially Jenna, when you're making that plan. How do you not get riled up in that moment either?
Totally. I'm on the same page as you. I think us anxiety-ridden individuals can relate to that. You know, everyone can project situations to be a lot worse. But I actually think if we take, you know, what Eric had mentioned and pair that in with planning, is that when you are planning these conversations, you can, you know, take what Eric said and redefine your goals and think to yourself, hey, I'm not here to challenge, I'm just here to listen. Or I'm not going to go into today knowing that Aunt X, Y, and Z is going to rile me up, but I really just want to hear what she has to say because her perspective is different than mine. So how can I learn from that? So when you are planning, you can even shift, you know, how you think about the situation too. So I think we could almost marry both of those tips together.
That's great advice, Jenna. Thank you. And, you know, speaking of the pandemic, something that I've personally been dealing with is having those conversations with family members who say, well, we still want to get together. And I don't necessarily feel comfortable with that risk. And so I'm trying to find ways to help understand, but also even educate. And curious, Eric, your thoughts around how do we have those kinds of conversations where we share our discomfort or worry, but can do so in a really productive way?
Well, I think you have to start by, you know, understanding that the politicization of the virus and the pandemic is probably one of the most regrettable things. And secondly, our information sources are wildly different. You know, we tend to live in bubbles, and we wind up getting information that's most comforting and suitable to our own way of thinking. And what's happened with the politicization is that people have profound differences of opinion when it comes to things like wearing masks. You know, when you really think about that objectively, you probably are asking yourselves the question, why would anyone have an objection to that? Why would anybody feel that way? And since we don't have much in the way of leadership from both the federal government or even state governments or local governments, I'm going to tell you right now, all of you have to be governors of your own healthcare. You have to be the ones who set the barriers. You have to be the ones who disseminate the information. And you have to be the ones to determine what makes you feel safe over the next 4 months. Because, you know, there is a prize at the end of this long journey we've been on. And once those vaccines get rolled out in probably spring, summer, we'll look back on this time and we'll ask ourselves, did we make the right decisions? Did we make the right choices for the long term? And so if you put it more specifically, Jamie, to the question you're asking, if somebody who I cared about showed up at my house and was not wearing a mask and was not wanting to socially distance, I would be very benevolently asking for help. And I often ask for help. I don't think it's a sign of weakness. And I'd say, look, I need your help. I'm over 65. I have a pre-existing condition. I'm very concerned that the virus is running rampant. I really need you to maintain your distance and wear a mask. Would you help me out with that? And if there is somebody who is receptive to that, we sort of move forward accordingly. If they're not, you've got to draw the line. You've got to draw the barrier. I think this is the most critical next 3 months in the pandemic, and the choices we make today are going to have profound influences on what our next year looks like.
You're absolutely right, Eric. And I love what you said. We're governors of our own healthcare. And I do think framing that as, can you help me, is such a good way to think about how we can have more of a productive conversation with someone rather than saying, no, you have to put your mask on. So that's really helpful. Ashley or Jenna, any other thoughts on that, especially, dealing with this pandemic of maybe we're, not all getting together at the holidays, but some family members might not understand that. Any other thoughts or suggestions?
Yeah, sure. I think, as we are considering going into this season, with so many constraints and just adjustments and sacrifice and grief over the traditions that we are typically used to and really wanting and needing in terms of community and connection and family and, all of the things that this kind of represents. And knowing that we do have to govern ourselves differently, that we have to be responsible and accountable to being able to take care of ourselves and each other. I think if we are in a position of getting clear for ourselves what this is about in terms of the fact that I want to be caring, but I also want to be informed, I might be feeling lots of complicated feelings because I'm feeling guilty, I'm feeling sad, I'm feeling the loss myself, but knowing I have to make this really tough decision for the greater good. And as Eric stated, it's not going to last forever. We're hopeful that this will be for the time being. I think if we're approaching it with this idea that we can validate, like it really stinks, like it just does. This is not ideal. It's not what we want, but I'm hopeful that soon we'll be able to come together again face to face and hug each other, being able to figure out sort of an alternative that could be helpful. So if the whole idea is we want to come together because we miss each other, we need to catch up, we want to see each other's faces, then we can create opportunities that might be a little bit adjusted, not what we want, but something that will still achieve that. So, we've been doing the Zoom and the FaceTime and all of that. And so being able to figure out, that for family who's far away and we're not able to travel, potentially family who's closer, why don't we do a little date in the park and just go for a walk or, just something like that. So just really being creative and sort of figuring out other opportunities to be able to get to what it is that we want to have, which is this time to be able to share together. And even though it's not how we imagined it to look, we can still make the best of it, and being able to kind of validate the fact that, we feel very sad about this, but this is, the decision or the thing that we're doing. And I can clearly communicate that to you so that hopefully we can, find a way to work through it.
Yeah, that's such great advice, Ashley. And especially, I think just admitting this is hard.
Yeah.
Mom and Dad, I really do want to see you, but I'm trying to keep best interest of everyone in mind and things like that. I think that's so important, just admitting that and almost having that shared moment of connection of this is hard.
Mm-hmm.
That's really good advice. And Jenna, kind of along those lines, a question for you. We are doing, I know I personally next week with Thanksgiving, we're going to be doing some Zooms and some FaceTimes. So how do we sort of make the most of this digital space that we're in? And how can we still have good connections around the holidays with those different mediums?
Great question. And I love, Ashley, that advice too, like validating, being vulnerable, bringing people into your world, hey, I know we're local, but we have kids at home and there's just a lot going on. And we just are, playing it safe right now. So when you are, offering those other creative outlets, I know technology can be a bit iffy. So when it comes to, and I will say this with a grain of salt too, because I also know that family is, once you get family in a room, people are yelling over each other, they're talking over each other, you put a computer screen in front of you, that's probably also going to happen as well. So I think embracing that, and then also maybe having things prepared. So we actually did a Zoom birthday party. I've been in a couple, where it was more of like a a program. So someone planned it. It was actually a beautifully done birthday party. And there was a program where people were able to speak. The kids were able to present what they were doing in school. So that way, you know, they're kind of involved. And then later on, they would sit around the table and kind of watch what the adults were doing and what the adults were talking about. So by thinking of it as a program, it might be a little fun, you know, to show the cookies that you had decorated, or tell stories that you've been, you know, experiencing internally, I should say, with your family. I put my corporate hat on there. But I think designing it as more of like a program as opposed to just a random link that you're sending out being like, get on whenever you can, it might create, you know, a fun activity for the family to do.
I love that. And I think, yeah, showing cookies, hey, here's my pie that I made, you know, what did you make for Thanksgiving dinner? You know, I think that's such a great idea.
Exactly.
Just a reminder too, I clearly, you all can tell, have lots of questions, but if you all do have questions too, as Kayla said, you can feel free to put that in the Q&A. I know I've seen in the chat that the comment from Eric about being the governor of your own health and mental health has really resonated. So if things resonate, put it in the chat. If you have questions, put it in the Q&A. Otherwise, I'm just going to keep asking all the questions I have. So one, you know, for you, Eric, you talked a little bit earlier about the politicization of the pandemic, but also wanted to chat a little bit. You know, we just had the election for president. You know, there are some people, and there might be some people at our Thanksgiving and our Christmas tables that, you know, really are thinking that there were irregularities with the election cycle. What do we say to those family members and friends? How can we have productive conversations with them?
Well, let me give you 7 steps on how to get along with Uncle Bill at the table.
Great.
And Uncle Bill is going to sort of start the conversation by looking at Ashley or looking at Jenna and say, you know, I thought this whole election was rigged. And now it's your turn to do something. So again, I want to begin with step 1. The goal with Uncle Bill is not to persuade him and not to try to win the argument. The goal with Uncle Bill is to understand. What should your state of mind be? I think planning is a good thing, but what we mediators know when we deal in high conflict situations is if anything is going to go wrong and off plan, it will, almost all the time. So I think the state of mind, step 2, is be curious. Curiosity is probably the trait that Albert Einstein valued more than anything else. Curious about what? Curious about Uncle Bill's perspective. What are the 3 favorite words of the curious-minded? They're my 3 favorite words in every conversation. Use them frequently. Help me understand. Help me understand. It's an open-ended question, and it's help me understand, Uncle Bill, why you think the election was rigged. There are 2 things that all human beings require. They require to be listened to, and they require to be heard and understood. They don't require agreement. When you ask somebody, help me understand, this is the next step. Listen and do not interrupt. Actively listen and do not interrupt. Do not script your response. We always think about what we're going to say next. Let that happen in its fullest. And then Uncle Bill's going to look at you, Jamie, or you, Ashley, or you, Jenna, and he's going to say, and so how do you feel about that? Here is the next takeaway. Your first thing that you do is summarize what Uncle Bill told you. So Uncle Bill, you think the election was rigged because you've been watching Fox News and you saw a program where 2,000 ballots were thrown out, and that's what makes you feel that's the case. And maybe you see Uncle Bill nod. And then you do something else that is a really interesting technique. Erase the word but from your vocabulary and change it to the word and. If you summarize to Uncle Bill what he said and you say, but I have a different opinion. But is like an eraser. It erases all the active listening that you've done. And is a bridge. And so what you say to Uncle Bill is, you believe this, this, and this, and I have a somewhat different perspective. And then you speak. If Uncle Bill then models the behavior that you've demonstrated to him, that conversation continues. Remind yourself that the end goal of the conversation is not to persuade or win. The end goal is to create a bridge for future conversations that are mutually respectful and enhance understanding. We've got to get out of the win at all costs. We've got to get out of the persuading. It doesn't mean you're sacrificing your beliefs. It means you're creating an understanding and a method of communication that allows you ultimately to explore more difficult issues.
Wow, Eric, that is so great and so helpful. And I love the "and" is a bridge, because you're right. I often will say, but this. So trying to erase that from the vocabulary is such good advice. And again, having that goal to have future conversations, not to win. You know, I do think we always get in this mindset of we're right, we have to convince someone else. So those are some great 7 steps, Eric. Any other, Ashley or Jenna, any other thoughts on that?
Yeah, I want to lift everything that Eric said. It reminds me of a couple sessions, but I think, you know, in terms of being open, like just having that stance of being open and wanting to kind of seek to understand. But I also want to sort of lift and hold space for people who don't feel that they could engage in that way, that it just might be too hard, too triggering. You know, Uncle Bill might have said something that, again, you know, just hit a nerve in a different way. So I just want to just kind of give space to say that's okay, that if you feel like you can't engage and be in that open stance, or you try it and you just feel like you know, just got into this cycle where you and Uncle Bill are spinning on the wheel, and it's just getting into that back and forth, because it definitely takes support and practice, you know, to be able to get to a point of having a conversation with Uncle Bill on that level. So wanting to kind of lift space around how to not engage at all, and being able to validate and acknowledge that people have the choice to make that decision. I can't do this right now. I'm not in a headspace to engage. And I, you know, again, thinking about the triggers that's happening, I'm recognizing I can't do it, right? My face is at that red point. I'm beyond the point of no return. So what do I do at that juncture? And so really it might be just that you say, hey, Uncle Bill, I, you know, appreciate what you said. Actually, I'm going to excuse myself right now. I'm just going to, you know, take a minute to go to the bathroom, or this conversation might be a little bit too hard for me. And I need to step away, but just being able to know that you're okay and safe enough to create that boundary, that this is not, you know, a time where I can make the decision to engage this. I'm too angry and I don't want to go there. If you are recognizing that you feel confused about what he's saying and you want to ask a question, then that might be the way that you can enter all of the amazing and on point things that Eric stated. But if you're feeling angry, like that's the base, like you're feeling very reactive, then that might be a good decision point to say, hey, you know what? I'm not at a point to be curious with him and I need to exit, and that's okay.
Yeah, thank you so much, Ashley, for pointing that out, because you're right. As much as I would like to follow those 7 rules that you shared, Eric, there are certain times where that's just, you may be too triggered, you might not be able to. So I think recognizing that is really important, and knowing that that's okay. Mm-hmm. We've had a couple of questions in the chat, and this is something that I want to talk about as well, but is around, you know, how do we start talking about topics like racism, you know, especially if I am a person of color and talking with someone else, how do we talk about those topics? So we talked about politics, now we're kind of going to shift into this. Any other ideas or thoughts?
One thing that I wanted to add, and I can expand on for this topic as well. I'm a very heated person. I say, I always say I wear my heart on my sleeve. So it is really easy for me to slip into those triggers, if you will, or to engage in those conversations because I'm so passionate about sharing viewpoints. And I probably like hearing myself talk a lot. But what I've found really works well outside of the holidays and in your day-to-day life is establishing this aspect of trust and caring just in your everyday interactions. So that way when, I'm at these family gatherings and I am getting into these heated conversations and I'm standing up for what I believe and what I feel is right, they know that, that's a part of who I am. And then I can step back and say, whew, like, I know that was a lot. This is coming from a great place, as opposed to being that person who's always trying to post a Facebook status that is getting a reaction. Or you kind of are able, like when I was talking about planning earlier, like you're kind of able to pinpoint who will be able to sit there and have a conversation with you and who you should probably avoid a little bit. So even in your everyday life, when you're approaching these hot topics of politics, the pandemic, racism, caring personally about your family members and showing that you care and that you respect their opinions and that you want to learn from them. The family dynamic is a lot. So being able to just, benevolence is a word that has been used a lot, respect. I know that Jamie at the Diversity Movement has also published pieces where, you start off by saying, I really do respect your opinion. Even just saying that can help diffuse the situation and help you continue the conversation further. That doesn't necessarily, you can say things like, that doesn't necessarily sit well with me. I'm eager to learn more. So you can call out those vulnerabilities, those awkward moments, and you can either continue and, dig further, or you can say that doesn't really sit well with me. I think maybe we should shift to something else.
Yeah, that's a great point. And what a great word to reflect on benevolence and kind of going into it with that respect in mind. Eric or Ashley, other thoughts about how we can, if there are microaggressions at the table made, if there are racist comments made, how can we address those? How should we?
Yeah, I think I just quickly read in the chat, it's hard for me to multitask and read all of that, but I feel from the perspective as a person of, Black woman, want to first acknowledge and validate that it's exhausting, right? It's hard and tiring and exhausting, and all of the feelings that you feel when microaggressions are heard or observed, or however you're interpreting that, it's hard to do or hard to deal with, and your feelings are valid. So if people are trying to sort of insist that their intent was not the way that it impacted you, just know your feelings are valid. It wasn't a mistake. It wasn't, something to doubt. If you felt it, you felt it. And, we'll acknowledge that and validate that here. And I think, honestly, and I started to say this before, it really is a discernment piece, right? It's understanding, this decision about how much investment do I need to have in this type of interaction? What is the level of relationship you have with that person? And again, like we said before, because we're guardians of our own mental health, it's perfectly fine to, take a step away and not feel like you need to fight this crusade. It's really about being able to pick your battles and understanding and believing, the choice that you're making to do so based off of, however you're feeling in that moment. And so I think the other piece too, like I said before, you could have some indicator for that. If you're feeling very angry, then now may not be the time to engage the conversation, that you might need to take a beat to regulate and come back to it. Or if you are just feeling really confused and you want to understand and you're in a position to sort of like figure out how to seek that out, then absolutely engage. So I would say, you know, there's no right or wrong answer. People, you know, this is going to be a marathon and not a sprint. There's going to be lots of things that come up and lots of battles to win. So it's not like we have to crusade and fight them all. Like, I think at this point, it's being able to figure out what is going to be a fit for you in this moment, and align with what your goal is for that time. Like, if you are gathering with family, at the end of the day, this is supposed to be about togetherness and celebration and gratitude, and that conversation is not aligned with it, then you know what, let's talk about it after we shop on Black Friday. Like, I don't know, like being able to figure out the right time and space is really important in communication. So I think there's that piece too. And then sort of echoing what Eric said before, being able to really understand what your goal is. Like, in your response, am I here because I want to be heard and I need them to know how I'm feeling or what I'm thinking? Or am I here to try to offer a different way to understand this, or provide some piece of education in the way that I, you know, I'm understanding it, or how I interpret what was happening and how that might be different than what that person thought that they were, or like had their intent to be, right? So again, some ways to sort of navigate through that. Being able to just let them know, like, what you just said made me really uncomfortable to hear, and it might be uncomfortable for you to listen to what I have to say about it, but because we're sisters or because we're family, I think it's really important that we sit in this discomfort together. Again, you have to use language that's going to work for you. Like, you know, if you typically don't talk that way, obviously don't use it that way, but just, you know, find a way to say, that stung, it may sting to keep going, but we got to do it. And then also to be able to get clarification on what they said. And I think Jenna started to say this too. If there's something that was said that was uncomfortable or microaggression that you're observing, you could just ask them to clarify, like, how did you mean that? Or what, tell me more about whatever that was said. And then that way, again, we're in that curious stance so that we can sort of open up and start to be able to kind of be that bridge, as opposed to trying to shut down.
Ashley, that was great. I was taking lots of notes on that. Eric, go ahead.
Yeah, I guess I would add, these are just wonderful observations. You know, I think it is absolutely imperative that in this country, we finally will have the honest and direct conversation about race that we need to have. Mm-hmm. And there has to be a reckoning moment. You know, my concern, and, you know, you might see this as a little antiseptic, but I'm sort of a process person. And the 7 steps aren't chains that you have to wear. You know, I think we all do better when we know that there is a process that we can fall back on when things get strange and when things get weird. But my concern in current society is, how do we have the honest, direct conversation about race when we've forgotten about how to have conversations? You know, that's really the elephant in the room on this whole thing we're talking about here, is that what has happened to us where we have sort of lost our way in terms of how to have an effective conversation. There's a really great book written by an MIT professor. Her name is Sherry Turkle, Turkle, called Reclaiming Conversation. It's a really brilliant book. And she spent the last 10 years discovering and analyzing what technology has done to our psyches. And it's not an anti-tech book. She acknowledges all the gifts that technology has given us. But she also points out that in an odd way, it's made us more alone and less capable of having face-to-face conversations and more direct conversations without worrying that somehow the floor is going to open up and we're all going to fall down. We're going to feel worse than when we started. You know, these conversations, especially the one about race, these are difficult conversations that require directness. They require honesty. They require authenticity. And there has to be some degree of trust that if we can have these conversations, at the end of the day, we all come out of it alive. We all come out of it with enhanced understanding. We all come out of it better than we were before the conversation took place. That's really the challenge that we've got to encounter first, which is before you have the conversation about race, how are you going to have the conversation, period?
Absolutely. Thank you so much for that, Eric and Ashley. And that was, you know, this is something that I personally struggle with. And I saw someone in the chat had put this in as well of, you know, especially now, I'm not someone that likes confrontation. I just don't. And in the past, I think I would have sort of let comments go by. And now I just feel like I can't, especially being a DEI practitioner, working for the diversity movement. Sometimes I feel like I have to tell my family, remember where I work? And so I do feel that responsibility when I hear microaggressions to call them out. And you know, it's exactly, and Ashley, thank you for saying that, because I feel like I have to pick my battles, because sometimes it's the mental health, but at the same time, there are certain things that I can't let go. But I love that idea of using these tools of asking questions and being curious and saying, well, what you just said made me feel uncomfortable. What I'm about to say might make you feel uncomfortable, but let's have this dialogue. So really, I love that. And I don't know, Jenna, if you have any other thoughts on this, but that's kind of where I'm at in my personal journey. So I think recognizing there are certain battles, but there is still a responsibility sometimes to say things. And I'm going to start using these tools now that I have them in my toolkit.
There's a lot. I've been trying to keep up with the chat, and I think that there's a lot in there that's really great, you know, depending on you know, who you are and what you do bring to the conversation. I would say two quotes that I've heard recently and that have stuck with me. Number one is from a professor that I had in grad school is, you know, listen not to be challenged, or listen not to hear, but to be challenged. And I think that if no matter, you know, what side of the coin you're on, you know, listen not just to hear, but to be challenged in your own worldview. So if you can go in and, hey, I'm going to listen today and I just want to be challenged. Everything that I'm going to hear is going to be a challenge, and that's my goal for today. And then the second one is, if you do want to engage in these conversations, and if you are, you know, ready for that, or you feel comfortable, one of the questions that I've heard recently that I think is really powerful, especially in the context of politics, is how is this going to change your world? You know, even asking a simple question like that, I think opens up the dialogue, because everyone has different backgrounds, different upbringings. They have different anxieties about the future and different fears. So to ask a question as to how is this going to affect your world, or how is this going to change your world? It gives you an opportunity to listen and to hear a perspective outside your own. And then it also offers opportunity for you to share, you know, the truth of what's going on in your world. So I would say those are the two. Listen not just to hear, but to be challenged. And then how is this going to change your world?
That's great. Thank you, Jenna. We have lots of good questions coming in. One for you, Ashley, is does waiting for the better time and place to resume a painful conversation risk increasing anxiety and making the situation worse?
Oh, that's a good question. Not necessarily. And I think a lot of what I would say around that is if you sort of acknowledge and sort of name it out loud. So say, we have a lot to talk about. We realize now is not the time to do it. So let's, you know, figure out a better time. So it may reduce anxiety to know we have this conversation slated for, you know, the following day at noon. We're going to get some lunch or going to get on the phone or what have you. So that might help a little, where you know, this is what's coming. And then you can also say, you know, it was really hard for us, and maybe this is a time where we figure out, the boundary around that conversation. So, you know, we might need to take breaks in the midst of it. We might need to just set up structure where I'm going to talk first and then you talk after that, you know, like however it is. But I think the more that you say about it, the more, and, you know, sort of bringing in what we talked about earlier about planning for a Zoom call, the more that we give that conversation structure and you sort of know what to expect, even though, you know, what we're actually going to say will happen live in the moment. If we put as much around that as possible, I think that will help to lessen the anxiety. I think the other piece too is writing. You know, if you have, you know, a bunch of thoughts going on and you're really worried about that, then maybe writing and getting some of that out so that you can kind of see what all is kind of knocking around up there, and help to clarify before you go into the conversation. If you want to set up, you know, it depends really on that relationship, right? If you're the type of people who need to set an agenda and like send each other bullet points, then go for it. But honestly, like as much as you can structure around it will probably help, because I think the anxiety is coming from, I don't know what to expect. I don't know what's going to happen. Is this going to be scary again? Like all of those things. So the more that you can speak to that and sort of address what those worries are, the better off you'll be.
Yeah, that's great advice, Ashley. Another great one in the Q&A here is, how do we support people that seem like they don't feel comfortable having those civil conversations and seem not to know how to get out of that? So maybe you're at Thanksgiving, you see a sibling that's having this tough situation, you're not involved, but how can you kind of be an ally for that person or step in and perhaps diffuse the situation?
I think to some extent what needs to be acknowledged is none of this is easy. You know, there's nothing easy about having a difficult conversation. And, you know, when I see somebody struggling, you know, sometimes what you've got to do is you've got to take Aunt Jane off and get a little space together. And you can see that they're uncomfortable. And you know, I will say, well, help me understand what is making you uncomfortable. And you begin to just sort of talk about things, and so maybe I can help with this a little bit. Do you think it would be useful? And usually it's not instructing, but asking questions to sort of find out, how can I be of assistance? How can I put this conversation together? You know, these are tough things to do. You know, but I'll tell you one thing that having mediated cases for a very long time has taught me. When you go through a really difficult slog with somebody or with a group, and everybody comes out of it with a increased understanding at the end and in one piece, it's really worth the effort. You know, really it's more of a internal on your side. How much are you willing to give? How much are you willing to be a sponge? How much are you willing to be a helper, to have something that at the end really emerges in a way that nobody really expected, but everyone feels good about?
That's great. Thank you, Eric. We talked about this a little bit towards the beginning, but it's come up again in the Q&A, which is about how do we start having those conversations before the holidays? So now, you know, in the coming weeks leading up to Thanksgiving's next week, Christmas is after that, about not wanting to show up for the holidays. And maybe it's because of, you know, COVID pandemic, or maybe it's because of being uncomfortable around family. How can we have some of those conversations now to be productive and kind of say, hey, we're not going to get together this year? What are some thoughts that you all have on that?
I think it's
well, I can tell you a mistake I made, because I was having one of those conversations in real time with somebody that, Jamie, you might know. And you know, the problem is, how do you tell somebody you love that you really don't think it's in their best interest or yours to actually physically be in the same space? How do you do that exactly? So I think all people who profess to be experts have to show how they've made horrible mistakes. Well, my horrible mistake was I tried to begin the conversation by texting. And that just wasn't the right way to do it. You know, I don't know why, with all my expertise, alleged expertise, I didn't pick up the phone, or I didn't arrange for a Zoom, which is better than text, where I could have a more heartfelt conversation. And I realized afterwards, the reason I didn't was I was so unhappy about what I was going to say. It felt terrible. And I didn't want to experience the terrible reaction to it, because none of us want to disconnect from people who we love and care about. So the question then is, how do we do it? And now, having made the mistake, I guess my only contribution is, I wish I had done it face to face. I wish I had done it by phone. I wish I had started the conversation by, do you know how bad it feels to tell you what I'm about to tell you? And no matter, with all of the things that I advise other people to do, I blew it. I just blew it.
Yeah, Eric, thank you for sharing that and being vulnerable to share that. I think we've all had those before where we make those mistakes. And I think being able to admit that is really important. And it goes back exactly to what Ashley was saying before. This is hard and I feel really bad about it. And I'm the same. I just sometimes want to avoid it, or I see text messages, I'm not going to respond to that. So I think being able to recognize that this is hard, but that the best thing to do is, this is really hard for me. Let's have a phone conversation about this. So thank you for sharing that. Ashley or Jenna, any other thoughts on how folks can have these conversations ahead of the holidays?
I would say, and this is a little bit more generalized in regards to the idea that because this is really difficult and challenging right now for all of us, it's really important to have a self-care practice. So I would say it's not necessarily a tip of like, what's my sentence starter, but more so a tip of the position that I'm in to be able to handle all of this stuff. Hard conversations, disappointments, all the feelings. So again, I think I said this before, being able to acknowledge them, being able to talk about it, write about it, seek therapy, like just be in community about the fact that this sucks right now. And then the other piece too is just making sure that you have ways to check in about how you're feeling and handling all of these. So, it may just be the fact that you lean into the things that bring you joy, or finding stuff that does that, being able to acknowledge, did I laugh today? Do I need to like put on a show that I know is gonna do that for me? Thinking about, I know there's been lots of jokes and memes about cocktails and drinking happening during quarantine, but if that's something that has been helpful as a way to escape in some ways. So like pulling in all your vices and feeling okay with that. I know desserts have gotten me through a couple hard days, and but mostly being able to talk about it. So finding, again, we bring up the word trust, the trusted people that can help you, I think, as Anessa is saying, figuring out how you're finding joy, or reminding you about ways that you do it. I know exercise is one of those things that can be helpful, being able to get outside and walk or ride your bike or whatever it is that you're doing. But do it. It's important. And that kind of brings you into the posture of, I can get in this conversation to say it's really hard and disappointing and I don't like it, but I think we need to not have a together Thanksgiving this year.
That is just such great advice, Ashley. And yeah, just that self-care piece is so important. Jenna, curious if you have any other thoughts about, or tips on self-care. It is such a busy time of year. There's extra stress and emotion happening right now. Any other thoughts around your tips?
For self-care, I could probably do a bit better. But I'm lucky because I just got married, so I was able to take some time off. So I think I'm okay in a headspace, but I also, realize now that I'm jumping back into work, a lot of people aren't in that headspace. So maybe even, if you have a friend, I'm kind of on the other side where I feel fortunate enough to have that space and I am in that okay headspace. But if you find yourself in the position that I am, maybe lending out a helping hand to a friend, to say, hey, are you, I know you have to, hang out with your family soon. Like, how are you doing? And recognizing that, if you have that relationship with other people, check in on them, ask them how they're doing. That's very helpful too, because if they know that they have a resource outside of their own nuclear family unit, to call or to text at that point in time, that's going to be extremely helpful. I know I have a couple in my network, and I have them on speed dial. So that's also something, if you're in that space, and you can lend help to other people, make sure that they know you're there.
That's great advice, Jenna. And that goes back to what Ashley was saying about having someone that you trust that you can talk to about these things. And yeah, just reaching out and sending a text. I know I've done that a little bit, and I'm so appreciative. I've had lots of friends doing that too. And it's just, it helps get through it. I can't believe we're almost up to our hour with this conversation. I feel like I could talk to you all for the rest of the day. Just want to open it up for space for any final thoughts, or things that you want to share with our viewers and all the folks that have tuned in today.
Well, I guess I would say that it is really astonishing that we have been going through this march together and this journey that none of us were really prepared to do, and done it during a period of great turmoil in our society. The truth of the matter is nothing good comes without going through things that are hard. And I'm optimistic. You can't help people resolve disputes if you're a pessimist. And my optimism is that I think 2021 will result in not only the alleviation perhaps of the pandemic, but I think we're going to get back to doing what we really need to do, talking to each other, being kind to each other, being good to each other. And for that, I think we all should feel a great deal of gratitude. And I'm grateful for meeting all of you today. You guys are wonderful.
Thank you for that, Eric. That's great. Ashley or Jenna, any other final thoughts that you want to share?
I would say hold on to the things that are important. And I think in reflection, this time has definitely helped to clarify values and the things that I'm wanting to look for right now that are bringing me comfort, bringing me joy, helping me to remember gratitude. So I would just encourage everybody to hold on to that, and that'll get us through.
Very well said, Ashley. Well, great. Well, thank you all so much. Jenna, thank you. Eric, Ashley, this was fantastic. I took so many notes. I can't wait to go back and review them. Thank you all for joining us today. We hope that you have some actionable steps to help make the holidays a little bit easier and less stressful. At the end of this webinar, you're going to see a 2-question survey appear. So please enter your feedback. We would love to hear from you all, and keep an eye out for 2021 webinar programming. We're going to continue doing webinars, and starting in January, we're going to have Being the DEI Practitioner with Dee McDougall. So be sure to tune into that. And if you all have questions, or if the diversity movement can help, please visit us at thediversitymovement.com. Happy holidays, everyone. Thank you all so much, and have a wonderful rest of your day. Thank you.